Welcome to the Roundtable, a show about ideas and public policy. I'm your host, Michael Hicks from Ball State University. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Strain. He is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. We are here today to talk about his new book, The American Dream is Not Dead. Michael, welcome to the Roundtable. I ordered your deceptively marketed little book here a few months ago. I thought it'd be a big, tedious read, a heavy book, but it's not. It's very easy to read. It fits right into the pockets of my dad's shorts, and I commend you on it. I also need to commend you on the way that you constructed the book. I mean, you were pretty clear that you were trying to challenge some of the status quo, but you also invited a couple other folks, Henry Olson and E.J. Dione, for Brookings to comment. And that's not an uncommon thing to do in an academic book or an academic conference, but it's surprisingly fresh in a policy debate of this nature. So it's all here in the title of this book, The American Dream is Not Dead. But you know, it's not a Panglossian book. It's clearly designed to add nuance to the idea that our economy and middle class are not dead. But you know, you don't shy away from some of the serious economic problems that we have. And you just begin by talking a bit about the common narrative about jobs and the middle class that you're trying to address here?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me on, and thanks for your kind words about the book. I agree with you that it is the right length. I am generally speaking, I'm a believer in the saying that every book should be an essay, and every essay should be an op-ed, and every op-ed should be a tweet, and every tweet should be an unexpressed thought. I intentionally set out to write a book that I thought was concise while still being able to address these issues, and so I think that did end up with a book that's readable. And thanks also for your kind words about the responses at the end. You know, I think that the issues that I deal with in the book are complicated, and there are issues about which reasonable people can disagree. I certainly have a view on these issues, and that's what you'll find in the book. But I wanted, this is a heavily contested set of issues, and I wanted to really do the readers a service by giving them other points of view. And of course, I reserve the right to have the last word, and I respond briefly to Henry Olson and to E.J. Dione at the end. To answer your question, the narrative in the public square about these issues is one that I would characterize as extremely pessimistic, and pessimistic to the point that it really is, I think, divorced from the underlying empirical reality. And so it is very common to hear the claim, for example, that the wages and incomes of typical workers and households have stagnated for decades. I just don't think that the data support that view. It is very common to hear that America is no longer an upwardly mobile society. It is very common to hear that the middle class, whether through international trade or through technological automation or through bad public policy, has been permanently hollowed out, and that there aren't opportunities anymore to earn a middle class salary and to lead a middle class life, or that those opportunities are vanishing very, very quickly. It's very common to hear these days that the game is rigged against workers. The game is rigged against typical households. These are some of the questions and some of the issues that I try to address in the book.
it is true that there have been some challenges. Automation and trade have cost some jobs. There maybe wage growth isn't as fast as we had thought. You talked a little bit about these bifurcation of jobs. You know, there are a number of people who are sort of leaving the middle class or maybe receiving higher wages or lower wages. Could you talk a little bit about that phenomenon and how it played into your discussion?
Senator Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, kind of a leading conservative populist. I quote him in the book as saying that the bottom 70% of workers haven't seen any increase in their wages and incomes in the last 3 decades. Very common to hear that from people on the political left as well. I want to assess the degree to which this is true or not. And this is a more complicated question, I think, than it appears at first glance. One thing you have to do is you have to define what you mean by 4 decades. If you want to, say that means the last 100 years, then of course there's significant wage growth. If you want to only look, at say, the period, so let's say populism really started to kind of spring up in President Obama's first term. So let's say you want to, look at the period from when the financial crisis happened to the 2016 election. There's much less impressive wage growth than there was, and so I make an argument that let's say 30 years, and I make this argument. There's some economic reasons why that's a reasonable time frame over to look at. But I also think that in terms of the policy debate, when people hear politicians say your wages haven't increased over several decades, what they are hearing is that the politician is talking about themselves. And so looking at a 40-year period or a 50-year period, I think is just too long of a period to look at. There are a whole lot of people who are working today who weren't working 50 years ago, weren't working 40 years ago. So I say let's look over the last 30 years. Then you have to say wages for whom. You likely don't want to include the millionaires and billionaires, as Senator Sanders would say, in that calculation. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the median household. I spent a lot of time looking at wages for production and non-supervisory workers. There's wages for workers in the services sector who aren't managers and who in the manufacturing sector are production workers. And then you have to do all sorts of technical adjustments to make sure you're controlling for the effects of inflation and household dynamics and things of this nature, et cetera, et cetera. That's all in the book. What I find, let's take wages. I find that wages grew by about 1/3, about a 33% increase from 1990 until, roughly speaking, when the pandemic began, until the end of 2019. That is solid growth, a 1/3 increase in purchasing power for typical workers. That statistic does not include, roughly speaking, that statistic does not include the top 20%. So a 1/3 increase in purchasing power for typical workers. That is not spectacular. It is certainly slower than what the top 1% enjoyed. It's not something we should be satisfied with. We should want wages to grow faster than that. And we should be very serious about public policy attempting to lead to wages that grow faster than that. But the question is a 1/3 increase in inflation-adjusted wages, a 1/3 increase in purchasing power for typical workers, does that count as stagnant? I think the answer is no. I think that is a That is a significant increase. It's a substantial increase. And it is an increase that has real effects in living standards for typical workers. So again, not spectacular, not something we should be satisfied with, less than the top 1%, but still significant and substantial. And I think it's important that people know that. It is important that people are aware that hard work pays off, that wages do rise over time, that wages are driven by productivity, that the game is not rigged against typical workers. This matters precisely because the populist narrative is wrong. If people start to believe that the game is rigged, if people start to believe that hard work doesn't pay off, then they might work less hard. They might aspire to less. And then all of a sudden their wages will start to stagnate. And so there's this kind of self-fulfilling aspect to the populist narrative. The more people who believe and act as if the populist narrative is true, the more true the populist narrative becomes. And so, simply putting some of the facts out there and saying, look, over the last 30 years, if you're a typical worker, you're not a manager, you're kind of in the bottom 80%. On average, wages have gone up by a third. That is a substantial increase in wages, a substantial increase in purchasing power. So understand that hard work will pay off, and that you'll be able to climb the ladder over time. The more people who believe that, the more people who will be participating in the economy and will be applying their skills and their talents, will all benefit from that.
That's an interesting point that I hadn't really explored before, the self-fulfilling effect of this. And I think that's interesting because you've admitted in some of your graphics a sort of higher end income, but you do acknowledge that there's been fairly substantial wage growth amongst better educated workers. So you see sort of more wage growth that those with STEM or more difficult degrees, at least more market friendly degrees, and then those with graduate degrees. And so it's interesting because there seems such a push for less education in many states that are believe that they're experiencing a gap in trades or manufacturing employment, but it would be sort of linked to this growth that education itself plays out as part of the effect of that. So I think that's an interesting point. You did adjust, of course, for the family perception here. If you look at family incomes, we see them being far more static, but of course families are much smaller units now than they were 40 years ago. So the per capita income within those families is rising, even though the average family may be earning less. And the real question here that I have is, do you think that there are things that contribute to this? For example, the way we're shifting our consumption pattern. We're buying, a lot more services, particularly things that we maybe don't value, like healthcare or education, that we don't see. They're not tangible necessarily because they're paid for by government or by our employer. And so maybe those are part of earnings that are missing and we don't see them in our homes. And that leads to the perception that makes it easier to buy off on the argument that you hear in the national press. Do you think that's a thing, or is that just a bad sociology?
Well, it may be a thing. I mean, I do think one thing that is happening is that as things like the price of healthcare increase, that is eating into wage gains. And so you want to look, I think, not just at wages. Everything I just said was about wages, 33% increase in wages. But of course, wages are just one component of how people are compensated. And of course, compensation is just one component of income. And so, a lot of the discussion about income inequality and a lot of the discussion about how middle-class households are doing, really ignores the policies that we have put in place to address inequality and ignores the policies that we have put in place to help middle class households. And so when, one thing I do in the book, I try to look at a holistic measure of income. And so I try to add transfer payments by the government, social insurance payments, things like Social Security, things like Medicare, subtract taxes, and really try and get a measure of the flow of resources that middle class households receive, regardless of where that comes from. And again, the total income is going to be higher than the wage income, precisely because we have public policies that have been designed to support the incomes of the middle class. The middle class receives more in government transfers than it pays in taxes to a large extent. So if you look at income growth for the median household over this period, what I show in the book is that they've had a 44% increase in their income. If you look at the income growth for households in the bottom 20%, their incomes have gone up by 2/3. And so, those are even more substantial than the wage gains. And so I do think that there is a component of what you're saying is really present, that by that wages are not the whole story, and that when households, I think, try to assess how are we doing, wages are a big part of that assessment, but they're probably looking at more than just wages. And so I think it's unfortunate that the public debate focuses as much on wages as it does, and doesn't focus on these more comprehensive measures of income that show even more growth than wages show.
Thank you. I think that's a pretty good summary of that. The other issue that was sort of is linked to this narrative of stagnation is that also means that there's no upward mobility for individuals. When you look at wages as a cross-section of people, you're capturing a snapshot of people in time. You're not tracking the same person over 40 or 50 years. So you also address this idea that Raj Chetty at Harvard and others, Harvard and Stanford and others have really addressed, is the end of opportunity. And you argue that there still is opportunity for upward mobility. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the point of the book is to try and look at the economic component of the American dream and assess its viability. And a big part of that is this simple statement that our kids should do better than we do. And a second big part of that is the kind of rags to riches story that people who were born in the bottom can make it to the top. You spend your childhood in the bottom, but you work your way up and you live your adult life in the top. That shouldn't happen for everybody. It's not, the American dream doesn't say that every child born in the bottom is gonna make it to the top. But if we see enough of that happening, then we can be confident that at least that component of the American dream is alive and well. If we don't see it happening at all, then that's going to be a problem. And so, I try and look at all these, and I try to do a pretty straightforward exercise. I look at people who were raised in the bottom 20%, and then I say, okay, when those people reach their 40s, how many of them are in the top 20%? And the answer I come up with is 7. Actually 6.6 to be more precise, but there's no such thing as 0.6 of a person. So we'll call that 7. So for every for every 100 people who were raised in the bottom, 66 of them make it. I'm sorry, for every 1,000 people who were raised in the bottom, 66 of them make it to the top in adulthood. That I think is, about what we would expect, maybe even a little more than we would expect. Certainly it says to me that this kind of rags to riches, bottom to top type experience is something that still happens in America. It's not typical. It's not what we would expect to see. But 7 out of 100, 66 out of 1,000. That's often enough that I think we could say that in the United States, you really can make it to the top, even if you were raised to the bottom. On the second question, do our children do better than we do? I look at the household income of people who are in their 40s, roughly speaking today, and then I compare that income to the income their parents had when their parents were in their 40s. And there I find that about 73% of people in their 40s today have a higher household income than their parents had when their parents were in their 40s, adjusted for inflation and doing all the economic adjustments that need to be done. About 73% of people in their 40s today have a higher income than their parents had when their parents were in their 40s. Not 100%, right? 73%. We would want that to be 100%. We should not be satisfied with 73%. We should have public policies to make sure that number goes up to 100%. But 73% is a good chunk. And, I think the answer to the question, is the United States still characterized by upward mobility? Should we expect that our children will do better than we do? I think the answer is yes. 73% of the time, that's what happened to today's 40-year-olds. If you look at people who were raised in the bottom 20%, there 86% end up doing better than their parents did. So upward mobility from the bottom is actually higher than upward mobility from the top. And 86% is even closer to 100. And so when I look at these statistics and these findings, it really says to me that America is still characterized by upward mobility. And of course, what really matters is not whether today's 40-year-olds out-earned their parents. What matters is whether today's 10-year-olds will out-earn people in their 40s today. We'll know the answer to that in 30 or 40 years. But looking at American society today, it's still a society characterized by upward mobility. We have more work to do. We need more upward mobility than we have. But it is not the case that America has ossified into a class-based society where the circumstances of your birth and your upbringing determine your later life outcomes, and where you can't climb the ladder. It is not the case that America has become a society where life is getting worse across generations and where living standards are falling across generations. And so I think the basic populist narrative about upward mobility, I think just gets the facts wrong.
In the minute or so that we have left, could you just sum up a few policies that you think might keep populism from interfering with the American dream, as the title of your book suggests?
Well, I think we need to focus on broad-based economic growth. there's really no better jobs program than a hot labor market. We need to focus on expanding economic opportunity. There are programs that offer earning subsidies to lower income households that have been shown not only to fight poverty, but to increase workforce participation. We need to get better at skill building, rely more on community colleges, work-based learning programs in order to increase the skills of Americans who didn't go to college. That will help them to command higher wages in the labor market. We need to ensure that people are participating in economic life. You need to have government needs to both advance opportunity and also encourage participation, encourage people to take advantage of those opportunities. We need to encourage economic dynamism and not make an enemy out of dynamism. And we need to be confident that that the future will be better than the past, that tomorrow will be better than today, that hard work does pay off, that workers do enjoy the fruits of their labor, not just because those are things we wish were true, but because the data show that those things are true. And what I try to do in the book is present the data that support those assertions.
Michael, thank you so much for being with us. This has been a very insightful show. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching the Roundtable. I'm your host, Michael Hicks from Ball State University. Until next time, good day.